Jane lay in labor for 9 days or more.
Welcome to Folk Files, a podcast that attempts to untangle the origins and shine light on misconceptions surrounding folk songs that have withstood the test of time. In today's episode, the misconceptions are ones that I held myself, and I was surprised and delighted by the twists and turns that met me while I researched this song. The song in question is The Death of Queen Jane, and you can hear the version from the movie Inside Llewyn Davis in the background, performed by Oscar Isaac. That was many people's first introduction to the song, but the song is far older, possibly stretching back to the 16th century. In the song, whose earliest surviving written version dates to 1776, Queen Jane is in labor for many days, but she can't deliver her baby. She begs for someone to open her up and retrieve her child, since she can't seem to birth him naturally. King Henry arrives and says that he will not cut into her because it would kill her as well as her baby, possibly. However, after Jane pleads and begs, Henry gives her her wish. She is cut open, the baby is retrieved, and the song discusses the dual rituals, a christening for the baby and a funeral for the queen. Growing up, I was the stereotypical little Shakespeare nerd who knew way too much about Tudor history. So, when I first heard this song, I thought, it sounds like it could be about Jane Seymour, King Henry VIII's third wife, but no, there's no way it could be about her because she didn't have a C-section, or else I would know because I know more than is healthy about Tudor history. It turns out, I was wrong. The song is widely accepted to be about Jane Seymour. Most of the album notes quoted by mainly Norfolk, the beloved repository of folk music knowledge, assume that the song is simply an inaccurate dramatization of the birth of Edward VI. For example, Cyril Tawney writes, according to history, the birth of King Henry VIII's son, Prince Edward, later Edward VI, on 12 October 1537, was a natural one, although his mother, Jane Seymour, died 12 days later. There was a strong rumor at the time, however, that it had been found necessary to cut the baby out of its mother's side, and that Queen Jane died as a consequence. Here is Cyril Tawney's version of the song from 1969.
King Henry was sent for, and to her he came. Dear lady, fair lady, your eyes they look dim.
I kept seeing similar statements elsewhere. For example, in a Folkways anthology from 1959, Jean Ritchie and George Picot write, many singers of this song, especially those in rural Scotland, will take oath that every word of it is true, and certainly it makes a dramatic tale. History, however, relates that Queen Jane died 12 days after giving birth to her son in a natural way. Paul Marsh, a singer and folk song collector, called The Death of Queen Jane a reworking of historical fact. Upon seeing these explanations that the song was based on a rumor about Jane Seymour that doesn't match with historical fact, I assumed two things. First, that this song presented one of the few, if not the only, narratives where Jane Seymour has a caesarean section. Secondly, I assumed that all historical sources pointed to a natural birth. Fascinatingly, both these assumptions are incorrect. This song is part of a tapestry of sources that suggests that Edward VI's birth was shrouded in uncertainty and propaganda. Most of my information for this episode comes from Alistair Vannon's article, The Death of Queen Jane, Ballad, History, and Propaganda. He, in turn, draws on a lot of the scholarship of Richard L. de Moulin, specifically his 1990 work, The Birth of Edward VI and the Death of Queen Jane, The Arguments for and Against Caesarean Section. Thank you to both these scholars for doing an immense amount of work weeding through not just songs, but diary entries, royal announcements, official records, and other primary sources. Their research suggests that the ballad Death of Queen Jane may actually have been factual, or at least more factual than many folk scholars have assumed. To begin, let's talk a little bit about the medical history of caesarean sections. But before we jump in, let's have a musical break with Joan Baez.
Queen Jane, she turned over
First of all, Caesar was not born by C-section, or at least it seems very unlikely. The term caesarean likely comes from the Latin word caedere, meaning to cut, not Caesar's name. I say that Caesar was not born via caesarean because his mother Aurelia lived to see him to adulthood, and by official decree in Rome, a caesarean could only be performed on a woman who was dead or dying. I had always assumed, another misconception, that women didn't survive C-sections until the 19th century, when the medical community discovered germ theory and the importance of sterilization. But no, the first mention of a woman surviving caesarean surgery dates to the year 1500. The woman was Elizabeth Alispachin from Switzerland, and after multiple days of labor and the ministrations of multiple midwives, she still wasn't able to deliver her baby. Her husband, Jacob Neuffer, received permission from the local authorities to perform a C-section. The procedure was successful, and Elizabeth went on to have 5 more healthy pregnancies. How was this possible? Well, for one thing, this was out in the country, away from the dirt and grime of the cities, and more importantly, away from the ironically filthy medical facilities of the time. Also, Jacob Neuffer was a pig gilder, meaning that he neutered sows. He was familiar with performing surgeries on female reproductive organs, just not specifically human ones. It's also possible that this story was entirely made up. It wasn't written down until 80 years later, which is a little suspicious, but the important thing to note is that in the 16th century, there was the possibility that a woman could have survived a C-section, or at least could have survived for 12 days, the amount of time between Edward VI's birth and the assumed day of Jane's death. I say assumed because it's hard to be certain of when Jane died. As Alistair Vannon says in looking through the primary sources, at least 4 different dates are given for the birth of Prince Edward, ranging from 10 to 17 October. 8 different dates are proposed for Jane's death, which ranged between 12 and 28 October. These date ranges suggest that it is possible that Jane died in childbirth. One of the main arguments that Jane survived for a few days after the delivery is that she signed the official announcement of Edward's birth. But the announcement seems to have been a little premature, since there is an instance of someone responding to the announcement 5 days before Edward was actually born. There are also eyewitness accounts that Jane greeted a select number of subjects in an antechamber on October 15th after Edward's christening. Additionally, there is a letter from Jane's physicians to Thomas Cromwell dated the 17th of October that details Jane's worsening condition. So, despite the fact that many of the ballads about Jane's death have her dying in childbirth, it seems she did live at least a few days after the arrival of Edward VI. You might be thinking, if there is existing documentation around the death of Queen Jane, wouldn't there be a reference to a C-section if she had actually had one? The answer is that there are accounts saying that she had surgery. The Rolls Chapel manuscripts from 1537 have an entry that claims that Henry, after being given the choice of saving the mother or the child, chose the child and authorized the caesarean section. But there are also primary sources that say she had a natural birth and died of what was known as childbed fever. Thomas Cromwell's letter to the King of France is one of the most cited sources for that version of the story. And this is where propaganda comes in. Because who would benefit from controlling the narrative of Queen Jane's death? Let's remember King Henry's marital history up to this point. He cast aside his first wife, who was generally admired by the English people, in a divorce that was scandalous for the time. Then, after only 3 years married to Anne Boleyn, he killed her. How do you think the English subjects would feel, given this history, if they heard that their king had cut open his third wife because he was told to choose between the baby and the mother? Do you think perhaps there may be stirrings of unrest? Claims that the man who had already split from the Pope was demonstrating ungodly, barbaric behavior? More importantly, how would foreign governments see it, especially those with eligible daughters? Let's return to Thomas Cromwell's letter to the King of France, where he explains that poor Jane succumbed to fever after a natural birth, something that happened to many women at the time. An act of God, if you will. This version of Jane's death would have been very palatable to Francis I, whose daughter Margaret would have been a possible next match for Henry VIII. Francis might have felt differently about sending his then 14-year-old daughter to marry a man who had performed a cesarean surgery on his living wife, something that was taboo across Europe. We can see how, even in the ballad about Queen Jane's death, the story from the Rolls Chapel manuscripts has been shifted to be more palatable. Listen to this verse from Bedlam early music.
Oh Henry, do this one thing for me. Rip open my right side and find my baby. Oh Jeannie, that never will do. It would least thy sweet life in thy young baby too. But she wept and she wailed till she fell into a swoon. And her right side was open and her baby was found.
Henry isn't given the choice of saving the baby or the mother. The mother herself begs for her right side to be opened. By the way, I couldn't find any significance to it being her right side. Some versions of the song say both sides. The version of Henry in this song seems extremely concerned that his wife will die. He doesn't want to open her up. This is not the case for a different song about Jane's death titled The Woeful Death of Queen Jane, Wife to King Henry VIII, and How King Edward Was Cut Out of His Mother's Belly, which is thought to have been written as early as 1592 and appears in A Crown Garland of Golden Roses by Richard Johnson, first published in 1612. A verse of that song reads, Being thus perplexed with grief and care, a lady to him did repair, and said, O king, show us thy will, the queen's sweet life to save or spill. If she cannot delivered be, yet save the flower, if not the tree. Note that in this song, the flower of England, which in Death of Queen Jane represents Jane herself, is now Edward, a product of the tree, which is Jane. It's a little confusing. Here, Henry's urged by a midwife to intervene and save the child. The procedure is described like this. And opening then her tender womb, alive they took this budding bloom. No ripping open someone's side. Opening her tender womb sounds much more gentle. Also, despite Henry being the deciding factor in Jane's fate, the song makes it seem like it was God's will. Henry has divine dreams and prays for guidance before making his decision. The listener is asked to mark the powerful will of heaven. The song is clearly propaganda, even before the jingoistic final section that praises King Henry VIII's lineage, except for Queen Mary, and has a whole verse adulating Elizabeth I. So, we have sources saying that Jane had a cesarean, and we have sources saying that Jane had a natural birth, and we have reasons for why the natural birth story might be propaganda. But there are also reasons why the cesarean story might be propaganda, and those reasons have been loudly proclaimed, perhaps suspiciously so, throughout history. For example, here is a 19th century footnote regarding the discrepancies with Jane's death date from the Religious Tract Society. Some historians have by mistake stated October the 14th as the day of Queen Jane's death. The error, probably at first unintentional, has been copied from one to another. By this, the Romanists have strengthened their legend of Henry's desiring that the life of the child might be preserved by the death of his mother, which they still repeat. The Romanists are the Catholics, and the argument is that the Catholics, Henry's enemies thanks to his creation of the Church of England, spread the rumor that Henry had barbarically ripped open his wife to save the life of his child. This theory was first set forth by historian Lawrence Eschard in 1707. He points to one of the earliest accounts of Edward VI's birth in De origine ac progressu schismatis Anglicani, written in 1585 by Nicholas Sander, a Catholic. Sander wrote that in the middle of Jane's labor, Henry said to save the baby, because he could easily find another wife. The problem with Eschard's claim is that there were non-Catholic sources, like the Rolls Chapel manuscript I mentioned earlier, that claim Jane had a C-section, and there are Catholic sources that don't make that claim, such as the Chronicle of Henry VIII, which was a Spanish journal of current events that was clearly sympathetic to the Catholic cause. After noting that Edward VI was born after 3 days of labor and that there was a rumor that the mother had died, it says, translated to English, "It was said that the mother had to be sacrificed for the child. I do not affirm this to be true, only that it was rumored." The chronicler presents this tidbit in a seemingly unbiased way. It's worth pointing out that Lawrence Eschard, the main driver behind the C-section is Catholic propaganda theory, held a post with the Church of England. Is this propaganda claim actually anti-Catholic propaganda? Perhaps a method of drawing attention away from Henry VIII's taboo behavior and the questionable origins of the Church of England by scapegoating Catholics? After all, it seems like there was a large part of the population that thought Jane Seymour gave birth via cesarean until the 1700s. It's a bit of a brain twister, but it's important to remember, especially given today's political climate, that if a government or church or other institution tells you, "Don't listen to them, they're spewing propaganda, they have an agenda," that might be propaganda. One of the easiest ways to trick people into disbelieving facts is by saying, "You're a fool if you believe them. Obviously, the other side is trying to trick you." So perhaps Jane did have a C-section and died from resulting complications. Perhaps she gave birth naturally. But the main takeaway for me is that folk music can be used as a historical source. Clearly, enough people believed that Jane Seymour had a cesarean for this song to have been so widespread. Of course, the song was eventually sung by people who had no idea about the drama surrounding Jane Seymour and who lived hundreds of miles away from Edward VI's birthplace. Cecil Sharp collected a version of the ballad in Kentucky from a singer named Kate Thomas. When Cecil Sharp told Kate that the song was based on a true story, she responded, "There now, I always said it must be true because it is so beautiful." Here's Peggy Seeger singing a melody based on Kate Thomas's tune.
Women, kind women, as I know you to be, pray cut my side open and save my baby. No, send them women that never might be. We'll send for King Henry in the hour of your need.
Of course, the folk process sometimes makes the story unrecognizable. For example, there's a version, also collected in Kentucky, that instead of saying, "Queen Jane lay in labor for 6 days or more," starts, "Jane was a neighbor for 6 months or more." It sounds like Jane may have lost her royal status in that one. Of course, sometimes some misinformation gets spread along with the ballad itself. Here is a recording of Duncan Williamson from 1987, collected by John Niles. I've included the last verse of his song, and then some interesting commentary.
So her sides they were opened, and her baby was free. But poor Queen Jane, oh, she passed away. That was the first cesarean birth that ever was. The doctor opened up to set her baby. She couldn't have the baby. So they opened up her side and took the baby out. But the baby lived, but she died. That's a true story.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's the way the song tells
My
the story.
granny used to sing that.
Oh, she, your granny sang?
Granny used to sing. Granny, was my granny talking?
Granny MacDonald.
I love that John Niles says, "That's the way the song tells the story, but," and then gives up on trying to correct Mr. Williamson's belief that the song is the true story of the first cesarean birth. This song collector, John Niles, very confusingly is not the folk song collector and singer John Niles who collected my favorite tune for the death of Queen Jane. The man you just heard is John D. Niles, a scholar mostly of Old English literature who recorded this as part of his British Isles Field Project collection. John Jacob Niles can be heard here singing the song as he learned it from a source singer in Kentucky.
Queen Jane lay in labor for 6 days or more. 12 women folk grew weary, and the midwives gave o'er. King Henry was sent for with horseback and speed, for to be with Queen Jane in the hour of her need.
It's possible that that tune is originally Scottish, because it is remarkably similar to the one that Scottish folk singer Isla Cameron sang in the 1950s, which you can hear here.
He came to her bedside, how comes it, my flood? I come to thee direct in less time than an hour. King Henry, I take you to be. Pray cut my side open and save my baby.
But of course, as we've discussed before, the folk process isn't linear. It's also possible that Isla Cameron learned the tune from someone in the United States. That's what happened with modern Scottish folk singer Corinne Polwart, who got her tune from John Jacob Niles, so what sounds like a traditional Scottish song in her brogue was actually collected most recently from a Kentucky woman.
King Henry came to her, and he sat by her bedside, saying, "What ails thee, my Jeannie? What ails thee, my bride? Oh Henry, do this one thing for me. Rip open my right side and find my baby."
We can't know for sure where John Jacob Niles' source singer got her tune. Maybe it came directly from Scotland. Maybe it's based on a Scottish tune but was fed through the Appalachian folk process, making it something entirely different. Maybe she wrote it herself or got it from another song. It's just another example of how it's difficult attributing a traditional tune to a specific country, because ultimately, folk songs end up belonging to all the folk that sing them across borders. Of course, sometimes it's easy to know where the tune of a folk song comes from. For example, in the very first version of Death of Queen Jane that I played in this episode from Inside Llewyn Davis, Oscar Isaac sings a tune that was composed by Dáithí Spruill in 1971, which was first recorded by the Bothy Band.
Oh no, cried King Henry, that's a thing I'll never do. If I lose the flood of England, I shall lose the branch too. I shall lose the branch too.
It sounds like Dáithí's tune is somewhat based on the one collected by Cecil Sharp. The first line is pretty similar, but it's original to him, and his melody has since been recorded by many artists, including Lorena McKennett and 10,000 Maniacs. I plan to talk a little bit more about surviving tunes for this song in this month's Patreon blog post. As a reminder, you can access any blog post for a one-time donation in the Patreon shop if you don't want to be a Patreon member. Also, an important housekeeping note. After this month, I will no longer be producing Folk Files on Spotify or YouTube. You'll still be able to find the podcast on all other platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, and Overcast, which are all free or have free versions. Or, if you prefer, you can just go to folkfilespodcast.com and listen directly on my website. If you are having trouble figuring out where to access Folk Files in the future, feel free to send me a message at folkfilespodcast@gmail.com. That's also the email address where you can send any questions, corrections, or fun thoughts about this episode. Thank you to those of you who have started conversations with me. I always love reading your messages. I'm going to end with a teensy bit more of Corinne Polward's version, since it's my favorite. I hope you've enjoyed the deep dive into Tudor history, political intrigue, and entangled melodies. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, that baby was christened the very next day, while his poor dead mother a-mouldering lay. 6 men went before her, and 4 more travelled on, while loyal King Henry stood mourning alone. And he wept and he wailed until he was sore, saying the flower of all England shall flourish no more. He sat by the river with his head in his hands, saying, my merry England is a sorrowful